My mom saw me limping down the shoulder of a busy road in the sweltering July heat, clutching my crying 1-year-old son to my chest. She slammed on the brakes, rolled down the window, and asked what happened to my car. I swallowed hard and told her through my tears that my father-in-law took it to teach me respect. My mom went dead silent for a second. Then she unlocked the passenger door and said, "Get in. This ends tonight." What she did next sent shockwaves through my arrogant in-law family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic in-laws who tried to control your life. My name is Megan. I am 33 years old, and until a few hours ago, I actually believed my marriage could survive my toxic in-laws. The midday Illinois sun was absolutely brutal, baking the asphalt beneath my feet as I limped down the side of a busy suburban avenue. My whole body ached with every single step, my sandals scraping against the loose gravel. The humidity was heavy and oppressive, pressing down on my chest, while my 1-year-old son Leo wailed against my shoulder. His little face was red and flushed from the heat. The straps of my heavy diaper bag were cutting deep into my skin, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the overwhelming humiliation burning in my throat. Cars whizzed past us, kicking up hot wind and dust. To my left, the perfectly manicured lawns of the upscale neighborhood mocked me. Sprinklers ticked back and forth, spraying cool water over lush green grass while I sweat through my clothes. I kept my head down, trying to shield Leo from the glaring sun, my mind replaying the absolute nightmare that had just unfolded in my own living room. 30 minutes. That was all it took for my entire reality to be ripped away. Just 30 minutes ago, I was sitting in my own kitchen quietly finishing up a logistics report for my consulting job while Leo finally took his afternoon nap. I work remotely, which has always been a point of contention for my in-laws. They never viewed my career as real work. The truth was far different, but I had learned early on in my marriage to Derek that correcting his parents was a pointless battle. Derek was 35, but whenever his father Howard entered the room, Derek instantly reverted to a timid, obedient teenager. Howard was 62 years old and accustomed to treating everyone around him like an underling. He ran a regional distribution company and carried that dictatorial energy into every family interaction. He believed that money bought total compliance. I was just typing the final paragraph of my report when I heard the heavy thud of the front door swinging wide open. Howard never knocked. He never called ahead to see if it was a good time to visit. Immediately, his booming voice echoed through the hallway. He was yelling for Derek, his heavy footsteps stomping across the hardwood floors. Within seconds, the inevitable happened. The loud noise startled Leo awake, and his high-pitched cries pierced through the baby monitor sitting on my desk. I took a deep breath, closed my laptop, walked out of the kitchen, and found Howard standing in the foyer. He was wearing his expensive country club polo shirt and a look of absolute entitlement. Derek was hurrying down the stairs looking sheepish and eager to please his father. I forced a polite smile and kept my voice calm. I asked Howard if he could please send a quick text message before coming over next time, just so we could make sure Leo was not sleeping. It was a perfectly reasonable request, but to Howard, setting a boundary was an act of war. His face turned a deep, angry shade of purple. He stepped toward me, his physical presence looming and threatening. His face was practically inches from mine, his breath hot and smelling faintly of the expensive cigars he smoked on the golf course. He pointed a thick finger right in my face and asked me who I thought I was talking to. He told me that I had no right to make demands in a house that he graciously allowed me to live in. He said he owned the roof over my head and he owned the ground I walked on. I stood there stunned by the sheer venom in his voice. I reminded him calmly that Derek and I are adults who manage our own lives. Howard laughed. It was a cold, mocking sound. He turned to Derek, who was practically shrinking into the bottom step of the staircase, and told him that his wife had gotten entirely too comfortable and arrogant. Then Howard turned back to me with a dark, calculating look. He held out his hand and demanded the keys to my SUV. I asked him what he was talking about. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, and said he was taking my vehicle. He told me I needed to learn respect, and that stripping away my transportation was the only way to keep me controlled. He called me an ungrateful woman who needed to be taught a hard lesson about obedience to the family patriarch. Panic started to rise in my chest. My entire sense of independence was tied to that vehicle. I looked at Derek, my husband of 5 years. I looked at him desperately, waiting for him to step between us. I waited for him to defend his wife, to tell his father that he had gone completely out of line. Derek did not step forward. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he stared down at the hardwood floor, unable to meet my pleading eyes. He shifted his weight nervously and muttered the words that shattered my marriage forever. "Just give him the keys, Megan. It is his house you owe him." I felt all the air leave my lungs. The betrayal was so profound, it felt like a physical blow. I asked Derek if he was seriously going to let his father leave his wife and baby stranded without a vehicle. Derek just looked away and mumbled that I should not have provoked him. Before I could even react, Howard reached past me. He grabbed my purse from the entry table, rummaged through it without my permission, and ripped my car keys off the key ring. He smirked at me, holding the keys up like a trophy. He told me I could have them back when I learned how to speak to him with proper reverence. Then he turned his back on me, walked out the front door, got into his luxury sedan, and drove away. Derek looked at me, gave a pathetic little shrug, and retreated back upstairs, leaving me alone in the hallway. I ran upstairs to comfort my screaming son. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lift Leo from his crib. I realized in that moment that I was entirely alone in this marriage. I packed a diaper bag with trembling fingers, grabbed Leo, and walked out the door. I just needed to physically escape that toxic environment before I suffocated. And that brings me back to the blistering heat of the asphalt, limping down the road with tears stinging my eyes, feeling completely broken. But the sadness was about to transform into something much colder. Right at that moment, a familiar silver car pulled onto the shoulder of the road. The passenger window rolled down to reveal my mother's face. Joanne, my 58-year-old mother, had just been running a routine errand. She took one look at my tear-stained face and the exhausted baby in my arms. I opened the door and collapsed into the passenger seat. I sobbed as I explained what Howard did, and how Derek just stood there enabling him. My mother did not offer empty platitudes. Her face went terrifyingly blank. I could see the rigid determination in her posture, a mother bear, ready to tear down anyone who dared to hurt her cub. She looked at me, locked the car doors, and delivered the words that changed everything. "Get in. This ends tonight." She did not drive me home to cry. She threw the car into drive and headed straight for the exclusive Oakwood Country Club. She knew Howard spent his Thursday afternoons holding court there with his wealthy friends, and she intended to strike while he felt untouchable. The stage was set for a public reckoning. The drive to Oakwood Country Club was a blur of air conditioning and absolute silence. My mother kept her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. She did not ask me if I was okay. She did not offer sweet, empty words of comfort. She knew exactly what I needed in that moment, which was a complete destruction of the fear that had been paralyzing me for 5 years. As the cool air dried the sweat on my forehead, I looked down at Leo, who had finally cried himself to sleep in his car seat. I looked at his tear-stained cheeks, and something inside my chest hardened into ice. The weeping, terrified woman who had limped down the side of the road was gone. In her place was someone who had finally realized that playing by the rules of a toxic family only guaranteed that you would always lose. We pulled through the massive wrought iron gates of the country club. The grounds were immaculate, with perfectly trimmed hedges and luxury vehicles lining the circular driveway. I looked down at my clothes. My shirt was stained with sweat and baby formula. My sandals were scuffed from the gravel shoulder of the road. I was the absolute antithesis of everything Oakwood represented, but I did not care. My mother parked the car aggressively close to the entrance, ignoring a valet attendant who tried to wave her toward the visitor lot. She unbuckled her seatbelt and looked at me. She told me to leave Leo sleeping safely in the locked air-conditioned car with her. She said she would watch him while I handled my business. She told me to stand up straight and remember exactly who I was. I stepped out of the car and walked up the pristine stone steps. The heavy glass doors slid open, and the blast of chilled air greeted me. A concierge in a tailored suit immediately stepped into my path, holding up a hand. He started to say that I needed a membership card to proceed toward the dining patio. I did not even slow down. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I was retrieving stolen property from a member, and if he wanted to avoid police cruisers swarming his valet stand, he needed to step aside. He blinked in shock and moved out of my way. I walked straight through the opulent lobby and pushed open the French doors leading to the outdoor dining terrace. The atmosphere was exactly what you would expect on a Thursday afternoon. Quiet jazz played from hidden speakers. Crystal glasses clinked. Waiters in white aprons glided between tables carrying expensive appetizers. I scanned the patio and spotted him immediately. Howard was holding court at a large corner table overlooking the 18th hole. He was sitting with three other men all dressed in expensive golf attire. Howard had a glass of scotch in one hand and was leaning back in his chair laughing loudly at a joke one of his partners had just told. He looked completely relaxed, totally in his element. He looked like a man who believed he was an untouchable king. I marched directly to his table. I did not wait for a pause in the conversation. I did not politely excuse myself. I stood right behind his chair, casting a shadow over his scotch glass, and spoke in a voice that was calm, but loud enough to carry across the neighboring tables. I told Howard to hand over my car keys right now. The laughter at the table died instantly. The three business partners looked up at me in shock, taking in my disheveled appearance. Howard froze. He slowly turned his head to look at me, and his face immediately contorted from relaxed amusement into a mask of pure, arrogant fury. He could not believe I had the audacity to track him down here in his sanctuary. He tried to quickly recover his composure in front of his wealthy peers. He let out a condescending chuckle and waved his hand at me as if I were a nuisance. He looked at his friends and shook his head, saying women get so hysterical over the smallest things. Then he looked up at me, his voice dripping with venom masked as paternal patience. He told me to go home. He said I was embarrassing myself and embarrassing the family legacy. He loudly proclaimed that I needed to learn respect, and that taking the car was just a little lesson in gratitude. I did not shrink away. The old Megan would have apologized and run crying to the bathroom. The new Megan simply stared back at him. I demanded the keys a second time. My voice did not shake. Howard slammed his glass down on the table. The sharp clack of crystal against wood made a few nearby diners turn their heads. He leaned forward, his face turning that familiar shade of aggressive purple. He decided to try and humiliate me completely. He raised his voice, projecting it so everyone on the terrace could hear. He announced that he bought that car for his son's family because I was too poor to afford it. He told his business partners that I lived entirely on his charity. He said I slept under a roof he provided, drove a car he purchased, and ate food his money bought. He called me a charity case who had forgotten her place. His partners looked down at their plates, clearly uncomfortable with the public domestic dispute, but quietly judging me exactly as Howard intended. I smiled. It was a cold, calculating smile that made Howard blink in hesitation. I leaned in, resting my hands flat on the pristine white tablecloth directly in front of him. I told him he had exactly one chance to tell the truth before I did it for him. He scoffed and crossed his arms, trying to maintain his dominant posture. So I unleashed the truth. I spoke with absolute precision, dismantling his entire fabricated narrative. I looked directly at his three business partners and introduced myself as Megan's senior logistics consultant. Then I laid out the financial reality. I told them loud and clear that Howard did not buy that vehicle. I explained that 3 years ago, Howard was desperate to secure a commercial business loan to keep his failing distribution company afloat. But his personal credit score was in the garbage. I revealed that Howard begged my husband and me to let him co-sign the auto loan on my SUV purely to artificially inflate his credit profile with a positive asset. I watched the blood drain from Howard's face as his partners suddenly looked up, their expressions shifting from uncomfortable amusement to sharp business scrutiny. They were investors, and the words failing distribution company and garbage credit score caught their immediate attention. I did not stop there. I kept my voice perfectly level and continued my public execution of his pride. I stated that I had paid every single $500 monthly installment out of my own corporate consulting bonuses. I told the table that Howard had never contributed a single dime to the maintenance insurance or purchase of that vehicle. He was nothing but a parasitic signature on a piece of paper. Howard opened his mouth to shout, but no words came out. He was completely trapped. He could not call me a liar because his business partners were not stupid men. They could smell financial desperation, and my confidence was absolute. I then delivered the knockout blow. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I informed Howard that he clearly had not checked the mail in the last week, because if he had, he would know that I quietly paid off the entire remaining balance of that auto loan 5 days ago. The bank had already released the lien. The title had been legally transferred. Howard was no longer a co-signer. He had absolutely zero legal tie to that vehicle. The SUV belonged solely to me. I opened my phone dial pad and typed 911. I held the screen up so he could see the numbers ready to be dialed. I told Howard he had exactly 60 seconds to place my keys on the table. I explained that if he did not, I was going to press call and report a grand theft auto to the local police dispatch. I told him I would gladly point the responding officers directly to his table at the country club, and he could explain to them why he stole a vehicle he did not own from a mother and her infant son. The silence on the patio was deafening. Even the waiters had stopped moving. The 60 seconds began ticking away. 10 seconds passed. Howard looked at his business partners hoping for backup, but they were actively leaning away from him, suddenly very interested in their drinks. 30 seconds passed. A vein throbbed violently in Howard's temple. He was vibrating with an explosive rage that had nowhere to go. 50 seconds passed. I moved my thumb over the green call button, keeping my eyes locked dead on his. At 55 seconds, Howard broke. He reached into the pocket of his expensive golf trousers, pulled out my key ring, and threw it violently across the table. The keys slid across the linen and stopped right against my hand. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a vicious whisper that only our table could hear. He told me I was going to pay for this. He promised me he would ruin my life. I picked up my keys, dropped them into my pocket, and stood up straight. I looked down at him, feeling nothing but pity for a man so small. He had to steal from a baby to feel powerful. I told him to enjoy his scotch and walked away. I did not look back. I strode confidently across the patio, back through the French doors and through the lobby. When I stepped outside, the brutal summer heat felt entirely different. It did not feel oppressive anymore. It felt like a warm embrace of total freedom. I got back into the car where my mother was waiting. She took one look at my face, saw the keys in my hand, and gave a sharp nod of approval. She put the car in drive and we pulled out of the country club. But the domino effect had already begun. The moment I turned my back, Howard pulled out his phone. Humiliated in front of the very men he needed to impress his fragile ego, demanded immediate and total retaliation. While I was riding back to my house, Howard called his son. I did not hear the conversation, but I would soon learn exactly what was said. Howard screamed a terrifying ultimatum into the receiver. He commanded Derek to get his ungrateful, disrespectful wife out of the family house by the end of the day. Howard threatened that if Derek did not force me into submission and punish me for the embarrassment at the country club, Howard would cut Derek completely out of the family business and disinherit him entirely. The war had officially escalated from a stolen car to a hostile takeover of my entire life. And my husband, faced with a choice between protecting his family or bowing to his father, was about to make the worst decision of his existence. My mother navigated the suburban streets with a fierce, silent focus. The air conditioning hummed steadily in the silver sedan, but my blood was still rushing from the adrenaline of the country club. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap. They were not shaking anymore. For the first time in 5 years, I felt a profound sense of clarity. Howard had finally pushed me past the point of fear and into a realm of absolute survival. But as the familiar oak trees of my neighborhood came into view, a heavy knot of dread began to form in my stomach. I knew Howard would not simply absorb a public humiliation and walk away. He was a vindictive man who operated on scorched earth policies. I knew he had already called Derek. I knew my husband was facing an ultimatum. I turned to my mother and told her we just needed to get inside quickly. I wanted to pack a few overnight bags, grab Leo's essential formula, and secure my work laptop. I told her I did not trust Derek to stand up to his father, and I wanted to be out of the house before Howard had a chance to return and escalate the situation further. My mother nodded, keeping her eyes locked on the road ahead. She said she would park in the driveway and leave the engine running. She promised she would be right behind me, ready to intervene if Derek tried anything foolish. We pulled into the driveway of the 2-story brick house that I had poured my heart into for the past 5 years. Derek's sedan was parked haphazardly near the garage. He was home. I unbuckled my seatbelt, took a deep breath, and gently lifted my sleeping son from his car seat. Leo stirred slightly, resting his warm cheek against my shoulder. I grabbed the heavy diaper bag and walked up the front steps, feeling a strange sense of detachment from the property I called home. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the heavy set of keys I had just reclaimed from Howard, and slid my house key into the front door deadbolt. I tried to turn it. The key stuck. I jiggled it, pulling it back a fraction of an inch, and tried again. It refused to budge. I frowned, thinking the summer heat had swelled the wood of the doorframe. Then I heard a sound that made my blood run completely cold. It was the high-pitched mechanical whine of a power drill coming from the other side of the heavy oak door. I pounded my fist against the wood. I yelled Derek's name, demanding that he open the door. The drilling stopped. I heard the muffled shuffling of footsteps approaching. The lock clicked and the door opened exactly 2 inches before the heavy brass security chain caught and held it in place. Derek's face appeared in the narrow gap. He was sweating, his eyes darting nervously past me to where my mother stood at the bottom of the steps. He was holding a cordless power drill in his right hand. A pile of fresh brass screws lay on the entry table behind him. He was changing the locks. My own husband was locking me out of my home. I stared at him through the 2-inch gap, unable to comprehend the absolute cowardice I was witnessing. I asked him what he thought he was doing. I told him to take the chain off the door right now because his infant son needed a clean diaper and a place to rest. Derek did not unlatch the chain. He gripped the edge of the door, his knuckles turning white. He looked at me with a mixture of resentment and manufactured authority. He told me I was acting completely hysterical. He said his father had called him from the country club, sounding like he was having a heart attack. Derek accused me of deliberately trying to destroy the family legacy and humiliating the man who had given us everything. He raised his voice, puffing up his chest to look intimidating. He told me that I was banned from entering the property. I could not believe what I was hearing. I adjusted Leo on my hip and asked Derek if he was seriously locking his wife and 1-year-old child out of their home in 90-degree heat just because his father got caught in a lie. I reminded him that my name was on the mortgage too. I told him this was illegal. Derek scoffed. He parroted his father's toxic rhetoric word for word. He said it was Howard's down payment that secured the house, and therefore Howard made the rules. Derek told me I had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Then he delivered the ultimatum his father had undoubtedly fed to him over the phone. Derek stated firmly that I was not allowed back inside until I got back into my vehicle, drove straight back to the Oakwood Country Club, and got down on my knees to beg Howard for forgiveness. He said I needed to hand the car keys back over and apologize to Howard's business partners for causing a hysterical scene. Only then would I be welcomed back into the family. My mother stepped up onto the porch, her eyes blazing with maternal fury. She looked through the crack in the door and told Derek that he was a pathetic excuse for a man and a terrible father. Derek sneered at her, telling her to stay out of family business. He looked back at me and said I had until tomorrow morning to fix the mess I made. He said if I did not apologize, Howard was going to cut him out of the distribution business completely, and it would be entirely my fault. Then he shoved the door shut, and I heard the unmistakable click of the newly installed deadbolt sliding into place. I stood on the porch staring at the closed door. A profound silence washed over me. The last remaining thread of affection I held for the man I married snapped completely. There was no going back. There was no counseling that could fix a man who would lock his infant son outside in a heat wave to protect his father's fragile ego. My mother placed a gentle hand on my arm. She told me softly that we were leaving. She said I could stay at her house for as long as I needed, and we would buy whatever Leo required from the store on the way home. I nodded, my mind already shifting from the emotional devastation into cold, hard logistics. I needed to secure my resources. I needed to ensure I had enough liquid capital to hire the most ruthless divorce attorney in the state of Illinois. I told my mother I just needed to transfer some funds to my checking account so I could cover the baby formula and clothes for the week. I shifted Leo to my left hip and pulled out my smartphone with my free hand. I opened my banking application. I navigated past my personal checking account and clicked on the high-yield joint savings account I shared with Derek. This was not just a rainy day fund. This account held exactly $65,000. It was money I had meticulously saved over the past 2 years from my massive corporate consulting bonuses. I was the primary breadwinner in our marriage, but Derek insisted our savings remain joint to build trust. I had trusted him. I had deposited every bonus check into that account to secure our child's future. The screen loaded. I stared at the numbers. The bold black font on the glowing screen did not make sense. I refreshed the application thinking it was a network error. The screen loaded again. The balance in the high-yield savings account flashed $0.00. My breath caught in my throat. I clicked on the transaction history. There it was. A single outbound wire transfer initiated exactly 15 minutes ago. The entire sum of $65,000 had been moved out of the account. I felt the blood rush to my ears. A wave of absolute panic threatened to consume me. Suddenly, the front door clicked and swung open a few inches, the security chain catching once again. Derek stood there looking through the gap with a smug, arrogant smirk plastered across his face. He saw the glowing screen of my phone and knew exactly what I was looking at. He did not look ashamed. He looked victorious. He leaned against the doorframe and told me that his father said I needed a harsh lesson about family loyalty and financial reality. Derek proudly admitted that he had just visited the bank portal and transferred every single penny of our savings directly into Howard's corporate business account. He said his dad instructed him to secure the assets before I could drain them to run away. Derek looked at the child in my arms and then looked back at my face. He delivered his final cruel assessment with absolute confidence. He told me I had absolutely nothing without them. He said my car might be in my name, but I had no cash, no home, and no leverage. He laughed a pathetic mocking sound and said I would be back by tomorrow morning begging for forgiveness, just like his father predicted. He told me to enjoy sleeping at my mother's house, and then slammed the door shut, locking the deadbolt once more. I stood on the porch holding my phone. My mother was practically vibrating with rage, ready to find a rock and smash the front window. She asked me if we needed to call the police immediately to report the stolen funds. She was frantic, worried about how we were going to afford lawyers and survive this financial ambush. But I was not frantic. The panic that had gripped me seconds ago completely evaporated. It was replaced by an icy, hyper-focused clarity. I looked at the closed front door, and a slow, cold smile spread across my face. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not bang on the door begging for my money back. I turned to my mother and told her to get back in the car. I told her we did not need to call the police because Derek had just made the biggest, most catastrophic mistake of his entire life. He thought he was being a loyal son. He thought he was teaching his wife a lesson. But Derek was a fool who never paid attention to the details of my career. I strapped Leo into his car seat and climbed into the passenger side of my mother's vehicle. As we pulled out of the driveway, leaving my former life behind, I was already calculating my ultimate counterstrike. Derek did not just drain a personal marital checking account. He had no idea what he had actually touched. That specific high-yield savings account was the designated tax holding account for my registered corporate limited liability company. The money inside was protected corporate capital. By logging into that account, moving shielded corporate funds and wiring them directly into his father's failing commercial distribution business, without my explicit authorization. Derek did not just commit a marital betrayal. He had just committed federal corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. He had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them both, and I was going to use it to burn their entire empire to the ground. Let them think they won the day. I was going to win the war. The patio of the Oakwood Country Club remained completely silent as my words hung in the humid summer air. Howard's three business partners sat frozen in their wrought iron chairs, staring at the man they thought they knew. I did not break eye contact with my father-in-law. I watched the arrogant smirk melt off his face, replaced by a pale, sickly expression of sheer panic. He opened his mouth to defend himself, to call me a liar, but no sound came out. His vocal cords seemed paralyzed by the sudden exposure of his financial desperation. I took a step closer to the table, resting my hands flat against the crisp white linen tablecloth. I told Howard that his little performance was over. I explained to his wealthy audience that I had not missed a single car payment in 3 years. I detailed how I worked 50-hour weeks managing complex corporate logistics while raising a child just to ensure my family had everything we needed. I told them how Howard had used my pristine financial record to prop up his own failing credit score so he could secure a commercial loan that the bank was threatening to deny him. One of the business partners, a man with silver hair and an expensive tailored suit, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He looked at Howard with a mixture of pity and sharp business scrutiny. The illusion of Howard's immense wealth and infallible success was crumbling right before their eyes. Howard finally found his voice. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He pointed a shaking finger at me and sputtered that I was an ungrateful child spreading malicious rumors. He loudly proclaimed that his name was still on the loan, and therefore the vehicle was legally his property to control. He looked at his partners, attempting a weak chuckle, trying to play off my accusations as the hysterical rantings of a hormonal daughter-in-law. He told me to go home and stop embarrassing myself before he called security to have me escorted off the premises. I did not back down. The old version of me would have shrunk away under the threat of public humiliation. But the woman standing on that patio had absolutely nothing left to lose. I reached into the back pocket of my jeans and pulled out my smartphone. I kept my voice perfectly leveled, devoid of any emotion that he could weaponize against me. I informed Howard that he clearly had not been paying attention to his mail recently. I announced to the entire table that I had quietly transferred a lump sum of money from my personal savings account last week. I paid off the entire remaining balance of the vehicle in one single transaction. The bank had already processed the payment and released the lien. The title of the SUV had been legally transferred solely into my name 5 days ago. Howard was no longer a co-signer. He had absolutely zero legal or financial ties to that vehicle. The car belonged to me and me alone. Howard's jaw dropped. His eyes darted wildly around the table, searching for a way out of the corner I had just painted him into. He knew I was telling the truth, but his fragile ego refused to allow him to surrender in front of the men he so desperately needed to impress. He crossed his arms tightly over his chest and stubbornly refused to reach into his pocket for my keys. He tried to maintain his dominant posture, staring up at me with a look of pure hatred. He told me he did not care what the paperwork said. He claimed that since he initiated the purchase, he was keeping the keys until Derek came to collect them and apologize on my behalf. I nodded slowly. I tapped the screen of my smartphone and opened the phone dial pad. I held the bright screen up so Howard could clearly see the numbers 911 typed into the display. My thumb hovered directly over the green call button. I told Howard that he had exactly 60 seconds to place my car keys on the table. I explained in a calm, steady voice that if he did not comply, I was going to press call and report a grand theft auto to the local police dispatch. I told him I would gladly provide the responding officers with his exact location at the country club. I said he could explain to the police in front of all the club members and his esteemed business partners why he stole a vehicle he did not own from a mother and her infant child. The tension on the dining terrace reached a boiling point. Waiters carrying trays of expensive food stopped dead in their tracks, pretending to adjust silverware while actively listening to the confrontation. The 60-second countdown began. 10 seconds passed in agonizing silence. Howard looked at his business partners, hoping for someone to intervene on his behalf. But the silver-haired man simply picked up his napkin, wiped his mouth, and looked away. Nobody was going to save Howard from the consequences of his own arrogance. 20 seconds passed. A thick bead of sweat rolled down the side of Howard's face. He was vibrating with an explosive rage that had absolutely nowhere to go. He was entirely trapped between his pride and the devastating reality of a public arrest. 30 seconds passed. I did not blink. I kept my thumb hovering over the call button, my eyes locked dead on his face. I was daring him to call my bluff. I wanted him to test my resolve. I wanted him to see that the compliant, obedient daughter-in-law he had bullied for 5 years was dead and gone. 40 seconds passed. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of a golf cart engine and the gentle rustling of the wind through the patio umbrellas. 50 seconds passed. Howard let out a ragged, angry breath. His chest heaved as the reality of his situation finally crushed his massive ego. At exactly 55 seconds, Howard broke. He let out a low, guttural sound of frustration. He reached a shaking hand into the deep pocket of his expensive golf trousers. He pulled out my heavy keyring, the metal jingling sharply in the quiet air. He did not hand them to me politely. With a sudden, violent motion, he threw the keys across the table. They slid across the crisp white linen, knocking over a crystal water glass, and came to a halt right against my hand. Water spilled across the table, soaking into the fabric and dripping onto Howard's lap. He did not even flinch. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a vicious, sinister whisper that only I could hear. He told me I was going to pay dearly for this. He promised me he would ruin my entire life. I picked up my keys, feeling the warm metal against my palm. The weight of them felt like pure, absolute victory. I dropped them into my pocket and stood up straight. I looked down at him, feeling nothing but pity for a man so incredibly small that he had to steal from a baby to feel powerful. I did not offer a parting insult. His public humiliation was enough. I simply told him to enjoy the rest of his scotch. Then I turned my back on him and walked away. I strode confidently across the patio, my head held high. I walked back through the heavy French doors and into the opulent lobby. The concierge, who had tried to stop me earlier, immediately averted his eyes and pretended to be busy with a stack of menus. When I stepped outside, the brutal summer heat hit me again, but it felt entirely different this time. It did not feel oppressive or suffocating. It felt like a warm embrace of total freedom. I walked down the stone steps and got back into the passenger side of my mother's silver sedan. She took one look at my face, saw the keys clutched in my hand, and gave a sharp, firm nod of approval. She did not need to ask how it went. She put the car in drive and we pulled out of the country club, leaving the manicured lawns and my toxic father-in-law behind us. But the domino effect had already begun. The moment I turned my back and walked away from that table, Howard was left sitting in the wreckage of his own pride. His business partners uncomfortably excused themselves, claiming they had urgent calls to make, leaving Howard sitting entirely alone at a table covered in spilled water. Humiliated in front of the very men he needed to impress for his commercial survival, his fragile ego demanded immediate and total retaliation. He could not punish me directly, so he targeted the one person he still completely controlled. While I was riding back to my neighborhood, feeling the first waves of relief wash over me, Howard pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking with uncontrollable rage as he dialed his son's number. I did not hear the conversation, but I would soon learn exactly what was said. Howard screamed a terrifying, brutal ultimatum into the receiver. He commanded Derek to get his ungrateful, disrespectful wife out of the family house by the end of the day. Howard threatened that if Derek did not force me into submission and punish me for the profound embarrassment at the country club, Howard would cut Derek completely out of the lucrative distribution business. He promised to disinherit his own son entirely if Derek did not choose family loyalty over his marriage. The war had officially escalated from a stolen vehicle to a hostile takeover of my entire existence, and my husband, faced with a devastating choice between protecting his innocent family or bowing to his tyrannical father's demands, was about to make the absolute worst decision of his entire life. He was about to choose his father's money over his wife's safety, setting the stage for a financial ambush that would force me to burn their entire empire to the ground. Derek had always been a coward when it came to his father. He was terrified of losing his inheritance and his comfortable position at the company. Instead of standing up like a real partner, he chose to act as his father's weapon. He was already searching for a power drill to change the locks before my mother even turned her car onto our street. The betrayal was already in motion. The drive back to the house from the Oakwood Country Club was tense but incredibly purposeful. My mother navigated the winding suburban streets with a fierce, silent determination, while I sat in the passenger seat mentally cataloging everything I needed to retrieve from the house. The overwhelming rush of adrenaline that had fueled my confrontation with Howard was finally beginning to level out, replaced by a sharp, pragmatic focus. I knew I had a very narrow window of opportunity to act. Howard was undoubtedly screaming at Derek over the phone at this very moment, demanding immediate and brutal retaliation. I needed to move faster than their anger. I needed to grab Leo's essential formula, his favorite sleep sack, my corporate work laptop, and the thick folder of vital financial documents I kept hidden in the bottom drawer of my home office desk. I turned to my mother and told her we just needed 10 minutes inside the house. I said I would run upstairs to gather the baby supplies while she grabbed the electronics from the study. We agreed to be fast, efficient, and completely ruthless in our packing. We pulled onto my familiar tree-lined street. The late afternoon summer sun was casting long, dramatic shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns of my neighbors. Everything looked entirely normal from the outside. The neighborhood was quiet and serene, completely detached from the domestic war zone my life had just become. A lawnmower hummed in the distance, and a dog barked 2 houses down. It was a picture of absolute suburban tranquility. But as my mother steered her silver sedan into my driveway, my heart sank rapidly into my stomach. Derek's dark blue sedan was parked haphazardly near the garage doors, indicating he was already home and likely in a state of frantic panic. He had beaten us there. I unbuckled my seatbelt, took a deep, steadying breath, and gently lifted my sleeping son from his car seat. Leo stirred slightly, resting his warm cheek against my shoulder, completely oblivious to the chaos surrounding him. I grabbed the heavy diaper bag, slinging it over my arm, and walked up the concrete front steps. I felt a strange sense of detachment from the beautiful brick house I had poured my heart and soul into decorating for the past 5 years. It no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a trap waiting to be sprung. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the heavy set of keys I had just reclaimed from Howard, and slid my house key into the front door deadbolt. I tried to turn it to the right, but the key stuck abruptly. I jiggled the metal, pulling it back a fraction of an inch, and tried again, applying more pressure. It refused to budge. I frowned deeply, thinking the intense summer heat had somehow swelled the wood of the doorframe, making the lock temperamental. I pushed my hip against the wood and tried one more time. Then I heard a sound that made my blood run completely cold in my veins. It was the high-pitched mechanical whine of a power drill coming directly from the other side of the heavy oak door. I pounded my fist hard against the wood. I yelled Derek's name, demanding that he open the door immediately. The drilling stopped instantly. I heard the muffled shuffling of frantic footsteps approaching the entryway. The lock clicked and the door opened exactly 2 inches before a heavy brass security chain caught and held it firmly in place. Derek's face appeared in the narrow gap. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting nervously past me to where my mother stood watching from the bottom of the front steps. He was holding a yellow cordless power drill tightly in his right hand. A pile of fresh brass screws lay scattered on the entryway console table behind him. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. He was actively changing the locks. My own husband, the man I had vowed to build a life with, was physically locking me out of my own home. I stared at him through the 2-inch gap, unable to comprehend the absolute cowardice I was witnessing. I asked him what on earth he thought he was doing. I told him to take the chain off the door right now because his infant son needed a clean diaper and a safe place to rest away from the sweltering heat. I kept my voice steady, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break down. I reminded him that we were a team and that he needed to stop acting like a frightened child following his father's orders. Derek did not unlatch the chain. He gripped the edge of the door, his knuckles turning white from the immense pressure. He looked at me with a mixture of deep resentment and manufactured authority. He told me I was acting completely hysterical and out of control. He said his father had called him from the country club, sounding like he was on the verge of a major medical emergency. Derek accused me of deliberately trying to destroy the family legacy and intentionally humiliating the man who had given us absolutely everything we had. He raised his voice, puffing up his chest in a pathetic attempt to look intimidating. He told me that I was officially banned from entering the property effective immediately. I could not believe the words coming out of his mouth. I adjusted Leo on my hip, feeling the uncomfortable heat radiating between us, and asked Derek if he was seriously locking his wife and 1-year-old child out of their home in 90-degree heat just because his father got caught in a pathetic financial lie. I reminded him that my name was legally on the mortgage too. I told him this was highly illegal and completely irrational behavior that he would deeply regret. I warned him that he was crossing a boundary that would destroy our marriage permanently. Derek scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes. He parroted his father's toxic rhetoric word for word, proving he was nothing more than a mindless puppet operating on Howard's strings. He said it was Howard's generous initial down payment that secured the house, and therefore Howard made the ultimate rules about who was allowed inside. Derek told me I had crossed a line today that could never be uncrossed by disrespecting the patriarch of the family in front of important business associates. He blamed me entirely for the rift. Then he delivered the sickening ultimatum his father had undoubtedly fed to him over the phone just minutes prior. Derek stated firmly that I was not allowed back inside the house to gather my belongings until I got back into my vehicle, drove straight back to the Oakwood Country Club, and got down on my knees to beg Howard for forgiveness. He said I needed to hand my car keys back over immediately without a fight and apologize profusely to Howard's business partners for causing a hysterical, embarrassing scene that disrupted their afternoon. He told me that only after I demonstrated proper submission and respect would I be welcomed back into the family fold. My mother stepped up onto the porch, her eyes blazing with intense maternal fury. She looked through the crack in the door and told Derek that he was a pathetic excuse for a man and a terrible father to his child. She demanded he open the door so I could at least gather Leo's medication and formula. Derek sneered at her, telling her to stay out of private family business. He looked back at me, his expression hardened with misplaced pride. He said I had until tomorrow morning to fix the massive mess I had created. He said if I did not apologize, Howard was going to cut him out of the distribution business completely, and it would be entirely my fault that our family was ruined financially. The last remaining thread of affection I held for the man I married snapped completely and irrevocably. There was no going back from this moment. Derek had chosen his side. He had chosen the money, the legacy, and the toxic control over his own wife and child. My mother placed a gentle, comforting hand on my arm. She told me softly that we were leaving right now. She said I could stay at her house for as long as I needed. I nodded, my mind already shifting rapidly from the emotional devastation of a broken marriage into cold, hard logistics. I needed to secure my resources immediately to protect my son. I told my mother I just needed 1 minute to transfer some emergency funds to my personal checking account. I shifted Leo to my left hip, resting his head securely against my shoulder, and pulled out my smartphone with my free hand. I held the phone in my right hand, shielding the bright screen from the harsh glare of the late afternoon sun. The biometric scanner read my face, and the familiar blue loading circle began to spin. I looked up. Derek was still standing there watching me through the narrow gap permitted by the brass security chain. Derek was still standing there watching me through the narrow gap permitted by the brass security chain. He was waiting for me to break. He expected the oppressive heat, the reality of being locked out, and the weight of our crying son to finally crush my resolve. I met his gaze with absolute defiance. I told him clearly and firmly that I was never going to apologize to a man who treated me like property. I stated that I refused to crawl back to the country club and beg for forgiveness from a tyrant. I informed my husband that I was taking Leo to Joanne's house for the night and that he could spend the evening alone, thinking about the massive, irreversible damage he had just inflicted on his own family. I told Derek he had completely failed as a husband and a father today. I explained that a real man protects his wife and child from abuse, but he had chosen to act as an eager accomplice to it instead. My voice did not shake. I did not shed a single tear. I wanted him to see the absolute certainty in my eyes. I wanted him to understand that his pathetic attempt to force my compliance through a physical lockout had failed spectacularly. I was not going to stand on the porch and plead for entry. I was simply going to secure my financial resources, buy the supplies my baby needed, and hire a legal team that would make him deeply regret this entire afternoon. Derek did not look chastised by my words. In fact, his nervous, sweating demeanor had completely vanished. A sickeningly confident smirk slowly crept across his face, replacing the cowardice I had seen just moments prior. He crossed his arms over his chest, leaning heavily against the doorframe. He looked down at the smartphone in my hand and let out a short, mocking laugh. He was not acting like a man whose marriage was falling apart. He was acting like a man who knew a devastating secret. He was acting like a hunter watching his prey step directly into a carefully laid trap. I ignored his arrogant posture and looked back down at my screen. I navigated past our standard joint checking account, which we used for groceries and mundane household utility bills. I moved my thumb to click directly on the high-yield savings account. This was the account where I meticulously deposited every single one of my quarterly corporate consulting bonuses. It was not a casual rainy day fund. It was the financial bedrock of our family. That specific account held exactly $65,000. I had worked grueling 60-hour weeks, analyzing supply chain logistics for international shipping conglomerates to earn that money. I had sacrificed evenings and weekends poring over spreadsheets and attending remote video conferences across multiple time zones just to build that massive safety net for Leo. Derek knew exactly how hard I had worked for those funds. He had insisted we keep the savings in a joint account under the guise of marital transparency and mutual trust. I had trusted him unconditionally. I had believed we were building a secure future together. I needed a fraction of that money right now to guarantee my immediate independence. The banking application completed its loading sequence. The digital dashboard materialized on my screen, displaying my entire financial portfolio in bold black text. I stared at the numbers. My brain simply refused to process the visual information being relayed to it. I blinked hard, thinking the intense summer heat and the blinding glare of the sun were playing tricks on my eyes. I wiped my brow and stared at the screen again. The numbers did not change. The balance of the high-yield joint savings account flashed $0.00. A cold, heavy stone dropped directly into the pit of my stomach. The air was 90 degrees, but I suddenly felt like I had been plunged into freezing water. I frantically tapped the screen, my thumb hitting the glass with urgent force. I refreshed the page, praying it was a simple network error or a temporary glitch in the bank's server. The loading circle spun again, mocking my rising panic. The page refreshed. The balance remained at absolute zero. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I clicked fiercely into the transaction history, demanding an explanation from the blank digital void. There it was at the very top of the ledger. It was not a glitch. It was not a delayed deposit. It was a single, massive outbound wire transfer. The transaction was time-stamped exactly 22 minutes ago while my mother and I were driving back from the country club. The entire sum of $65,000 had been electronically moved, completely wiping out 2 years of my relentless sacrifice and labor. The money was gone. Every single penny had been siphoned away, leaving me standing on a blistering concrete porch with a baby in my arms and absolutely no financial lifeline to fall back on. I looked up from the glowing screen. The blood was roaring in my ears, drowning out the distant hum of neighborhood lawnmowers. Through the 2-inch gap in the doorway, Derek's smirk had widened into a full-blown grin of pure malicious triumph. He saw the sheer horror register on my face, and he absolutely reveled in it. He unlatched the heavy brass security chain and pushed the front door open a few more inches, exposing himself fully to the oppressive summer heat. He wanted to make sure I heard every single word of his victory speech clearly. He looked down at me, his eyes cold and devoid of any husbandly affection. He did not look like the man I had married 5 years ago. He looked exactly like a younger clone of his tyrannical father. He leaned casually against the doorframe and delivered the fatal blow to our marriage with a sickening level of pride. "Dad said you needed to learn about family loyalty and respect." Derek stated, his voice dripping with condescension. He looked at my phone and then back up to my face. I transferred all the money to his corporate account. The sheer audacity of his confession paralyzed me. He was openly admitting to wiping out my entire life savings on the direct orders of a man who had just tried to steal my car. He was weaponizing my own hard-earned wealth against me to force my submission. "You have absolutely nothing without us." Derek continued, his tone arrogant and final. He gestured dismissively at the diaper bag slung over my shoulder and the exhausted child resting against my chest. He told me that my little display of rebellion at the country club was completely pointless because I lacked the financial power to sustain it. "You will be back by tomorrow," he promised confidently. He let out a harsh laugh, assuring me that one night sleeping in my mother's spare bedroom with no money to buy diapers would break my spirit. He was absolutely certain that by morning I would be crawling back up these very front steps, ready to hand over my car keys and beg for his father's forgiveness, just so I could have access to my own money again. I stood frozen on the concrete porch, the heat radiating up through the soles of my shoes. The magnitude of the betrayal was so vast it felt suffocating. Derek had not just locked me out of a physical building. He had systematically attempted to trap me in a corner with no exits. He had orchestrated a targeted financial ambush designed to strip away my autonomy, my security, and my dignity, all in one swift motion. He had transformed my trusting nature into a weapon and handed the hilt directly to his father. My mother stepped closer to me, her eyes darting between my pale face and the glowing screen of my smartphone. She saw the zero balance illuminated in the bright sunlight. I heard her draw in a sharp, ragged breath of disbelief. She looked up at Derek standing in the doorway, and the pure, unadulterated disgust radiating from her features was palpable. She opened her mouth to scream at him, to unleash a torrent of righteous maternal fury upon the man who had just robbed her daughter blind. But before she could utter a single word, Derek stepped back into the cool, air-conditioned foyer of the house. He gave me one last pathetic look of manufactured superiority. He told me to enjoy my time in poverty and forcefully slammed the heavy oak door shut right in our faces. The loud, sharp click of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed across the quiet suburban street, sealing me outside in the sweltering heat, with nothing but the clothes on my back, a hungry child in my arms, and an empty bank account. The standoff was over. The ambush was complete. I was entirely financially severed. I stood on that blistering concrete porch, staring at the heavy oak door that my husband had just slammed in my face. The absolute silence of the suburban afternoon pressed in around me, broken only by the distant hum of an air conditioning unit. A normal person would have collapsed. A normal person would have banged their fists against the wood, screaming and crying, until the neighbors peeked through their blinds. The old version of Megan certainly would have done exactly that. But the woman standing there, holding an empty bank account on a glowing screen, did not shed a single tear. The panic that had seized my throat just moments before completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrifying icy calm. My mother, Joanne, took a hesitant step toward me. She reached out and touched my arm, her voice tight with worry. She asked me what was wrong and what Derek had shown me through the crack in the door. I turned to look at her, and my face must have been completely devoid of emotion because she physically recoiled slightly. I held up my phone and showed her the banking app. I told her in a voice so steady it did not sound like my own that Derek had just drained $65,000 from my savings and wired it directly into Howard's corporate business account. Joanna's jaw dropped. The maternal fury that had been radiating from her instantly shifted into sheer disbelief and panic. She grabbed my arm tighter, pulling me away from the front door and toward the driveway. She told me we needed to get back into the car immediately. She said we were driving straight to the local police precinct to file a report for grand larceny. She was already mentally calculating how much a decent lawyer would cost, and wondering aloud if we could freeze the transfer before it officially cleared the Federal Reserve System. I did not move toward the police station. I walked methodically to my recovered SUV and gently strapped Leo back into his car seat. He was still sleeping, his tiny chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm, totally oblivious to the fact that his father had just stolen his entire financial future. I closed the car door quietly and turned to my mother. I shook my head and told her we were not calling the police. Not today. Not yet. Joanne looked at me like I had completely lost my mind. She asked me if the heat was getting to me. She reminded me that Derek had just robbed me blind and handed the money to a man who had tried to steal my car less than an hour ago. She demanded to know why I was not completely hysterical. I looked at my mother and a slow, cold smile spread across my face. I told her I was not hysterical because Derek was a massive idiot who never bothered to understand how my career actually worked. I explained that Derek thought he was just being a loyal son. He thought he was teaching his disobedient wife a harsh financial lesson by draining a standard marital savings account. But Derek never paid attention to the fine print of my corporate consulting contracts. I told Joanne that the high-yield savings account Derek just emptied was not a personal rainy day fund. It was the designated tax holding account for my registered corporate limited liability company. I operated all my international logistics consulting under a heavily shielded LLC structure to protect my assets and manage my massive quarterly bonuses. The $65,000 inside that specific account was protected corporate capital meant to cover my federal and state tax liabilities for the fiscal year. Joanne's eyes widened as the realization slowly dawned on her. I continued, my voice dropping to a low, calculating whisper. I explained that by logging into that specific account, deliberately moving shielded corporate funds, and wiring them directly into his father's failing commercial distribution business, without my explicit authorization, Derek did not just commit a marital betrayal. He did not just drain a joint checking account. Derek had just committed federal corporate embezzlement and wire fraud across state lines. I told my mother that Derek had inadvertently handed me the exact weapon I needed to absolutely destroy them both. If I called the local police right now, it would be a messy domestic dispute over marital assets that could drag on in family court for years. But if I let that wire transfer clear the federal banking system and hit Howard's failing business account, I could trigger a federal investigation that would bring the IRS and the Bank Fraud Division crashing down on their heads. I was not going to stop the transfer. I was going to let them take the money. I was going to let them think they had won. I told Joanne to get into the car. I said we were going to her house to feed Leo, and then I was going to spend the entire night preparing the most devastating legal trap in the history of Cook County. Let Howard feel powerful tonight. I was going to burn his entire empire to the ground by the end of the week. We pulled out of my neighborhood, leaving the brick house and my cowardly husband behind. The drive to my mother's house was quiet. Joanne kept glancing at me from the driver's seat, clearly unnerved by the absolute lack of emotion I was displaying. I was not grieving my marriage anymore. I was simply organizing logistics exactly as I did for my corporate clients. I was compiling a mental list of every document, every contract, and every piece of financial leverage I possessed. When we arrived at Joanne's modest ranch-style house, she immediately took Leo into the kitchen to prepare a bottle and some solid food. I went straight to the guest bedroom and set up my command center. I pulled my sleek corporate laptop from the diaper bag, plugged it in, and booted it up. I connected to a secure virtual private network and logged directly into my corporate financial portals. I needed to document every single digital footprint Derek had just made. I downloaded the exact timestamp of the wire transfer. I captured the IP address logged by the banking application, proving the transfer was initiated from my home Wi-Fi network while I was physically at the country club. I pulled the corporate registration documents for Howard's distribution company, verifying the exact routing numbers Derek had sent the money to. I was building an airtight, irrefutable case of corporate theft. While I was downloading the final batch of PDF statements, my phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text message from Susan, my mother-in-law. I stared at the screen, the notification preview glowing brightly in the dim guest room. The text was short and dripping with venom. It read, "I heard what you did to Howard today. You are sick. Do not bother coming back until you learn how to respect this family." I scoffed quietly. Susan was playing her part perfectly. She was the loyal enabler, always ready to defend Howard's tyrannical behavior and attack anyone who dared to challenge him. I did not reply. I took a screenshot of the message and saved it to a newly created folder on my desktop labeled Evidence. I knew Susan would not stop at a single text message. She was a woman who thrived on suburban gossip and social manipulation. She would absolutely take this public, and I needed to be ready for the smear campaign that was undoubtedly coming. I closed my laptop and walked into the kitchen. Joanne was sitting at the small wooden table feeding Leo mashed sweet potatoes. She looked up at me, her face lined with worry and exhaustion. She asked me what the next step was. She wanted to know if I was going to call a divorce attorney in the morning. I shook my head. I told her a standard divorce attorney was not going to cut it for what I had planned. I needed a corporate litigator who specialized in financial fraud and asset recovery. I needed someone who understood how to dismantle a failing business from the inside out. I pulled out a notepad and began writing down a timeline. I told Joanne that for the next 72 hours, I was going to be completely unreachable to the outside world. I was going to ignore every text, every call, and every threat they threw at me. I was going to let them build a false sense of security while I quietly orchestrated their total annihilation. I looked at my son, who was happily babbling and smearing sweet potato across his high chair tray. He was the only reason I had tolerated Howard's abuse and Derek's cowardice for so long. I had wanted him to have a complete family. But looking at him now, I realized that protecting him meant removing him entirely from their toxic influence. I was not just fighting for my money or my pride anymore. I was fighting for my son's future, and I was not going to take any prisoners. The first night in the guest bedroom was long and restless. My mind was racing with contingency plans and legal strategies. I mapped out every possible move Howard and Derek could make and prepared a devastating countermeasure for each one. I was operating on pure adrenaline and righteous fury. By the time the sun began to rise over the quiet suburban street, I had a complete ironclad battle plan. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait for them to walk directly into it. The financial ambush they thought would break me was going to be the very thing that set me completely free. The first 24 hours in my mother's guest room were spent in absolute methodical silence. I did not cry. I did not sleep. I drank black coffee and stared at the glowing screen of my laptop, building a digital fortress that Derek and Howard could never breach. But while I was operating in the cold, calculating world of corporate finance, my mother-in-law, Susan, was busy operating in the only realm she truly understood: suburban social warfare. Susan was a woman who lived her entire life for the approval of her country club peers. She weaponized gossip the way a sniper uses a rifle from a distance, with devastating accuracy, and always hidden behind a facade of plausible deniability. I knew she would not let the humiliation at the country club go unanswered. Howard had undoubtedly returned home furious and demanded that Susan handle the social fallout. She executed his orders with terrifying efficiency. It started on the morning of the second day. My phone, which had been relatively quiet, suddenly began to vibrate incessantly against the wooden desk. I ignored the calls, focusing entirely on transferring my corporate assets into secondary protected accounts. But my mother, Joanne, walked into the room holding her own iPad, her face a mixture of deep concern and rising anger. She placed the tablet on the desk right next to my laptop and told me I needed to see what Susan was doing. I glanced over at the screen. Susan had posted a lengthy emotional status update on Facebook tagging every single mutual friend, distant relative, and community acquaintance we shared. The post was a masterclass in manipulative victimhood. It was designed to completely destroy my reputation before I even had a chance to defend myself. The post began with a photograph of Susan and Derek looking appropriately somber and exhausted. The caption read, "Please keep our family in your deepest prayers today. We are going through an unimaginable crisis." Susan then proceeded to weave a completely fabricated narrative that painted me as a dangerous, unstable monster. She claimed that I had suffered a sudden violent mental break due to the stress of balancing motherhood and my remote job. She stated publicly that I had stolen Howard's personal vehicle in a fit of manic rage and sped away from the country club, endangering the lives of everyone around me. But the most sickening part of her post was the final paragraph. Susan claimed that I had kidnapped her precious grandson Leo and refused to let his desperate father see him. She begged her network to pray for Leo's safe return to his loving, stable family. I read the post twice, processing the sheer audacity of her lies. She had perfectly flipped the narrative. The woman who had been locked out of her own home in 90-degree heat while her husband drained her life savings was now being painted as a deranged kidnapper. Susan had expertly crafted a story that triggered immediate sympathy for Derek and Howard while entirely isolating me. She knew exactly which buttons to push within our affluent social circle, where appearances were everything and mental instability was the ultimate taboo. The comments under the post were already flooding in by the hundreds. People I had hosted for dinner parties, women I had sat next to at neighborhood association meetings, and even distant cousins who barely knew me were chiming in with their judgments. They offered prayers for Derek. They called me selfish, unstable, and dangerous. They urged Howard to call the police and file an Amber Alert. Joanne was livid. She paced the small guest room, demanding that we post a rebuttal immediately. She wanted to log into her own account and expose every single lie Susan had just typed. She wanted to tell the world about the lockout, the stolen $65,000, and the absolute cowardice of my husband. I reached out and gently closed her iPad, silencing the notification pings. I told my mother firmly that we were going to do absolutely nothing. Joanne stared at me, completely baffled by my restraint. She asked how I could possibly sit there and let Susan assassinate my character in front of the entire community. I looked back at my glowing laptop screen, watching the progress bar on a massive data download from my corporate server. I explained to my mother that engaging in a Facebook war with Susan was exactly what Howard wanted. He wanted me to look hysterical. He wanted me to post angry rants and stoop to their level because it would only validate Susan's fabricated narrative of my mental instability. I told Joanne that social media gossip was irrelevant in the grand scheme of what I was building. Let Susan have her likes and her sympathetic comments. I was dealing in federal law, corporate equity, and undeniable financial reality. I told my mother that when you are holding a royal flush, you do not need to brag about your hand before you lay it on the table. The social fallout intensified rapidly over the next 48 hours. My phone became a toxic repository of judgment and condemnation. I received aggressive text messages from Derek's aunts demanding to know why I was keeping a child from his father. A woman from my neighborhood book club sent me a lengthy email suggesting I seek immediate psychiatric help before I ruined my marriage permanently. Even a former college roommate who I had not spoken to in 3 years forwarded me Susan's post. and asked if I was safe. The sheer volume of the coordinated attack was staggering. Susan was relentless, utilizing every connection she had to ensure that I was completely ostracized from my own life. I sat at the desk in the guest bedroom, surrounded by silence, ignoring every single notification. I did not block the numbers, and I did not delete the messages. I took screenshots of every piece of digital harassment, systematically organizing them into a designated legal file. Susan's smear campaign was incredibly painful to witness, but it was also incredibly useful. She was actively providing me with documented evidence of targeted defamation, character assassination, and severe parental alienation tactics. Every tearful lie she posted, and every aggressive text her flying monkeys sent was another nail in Derek's proverbial coffin. They thought they were destroying my support system, but they were actually handing my future divorce attorney a goldmine of leverage. By the evening of the third day, the silence from my end was clearly beginning to unnerve them. They had expected me to crack. They had anticipated angry phone calls, tearful apologies, or desperate pleas to see Derek. They needed my emotional reaction to fuel their narrative. My absolute refusal to engage was throwing a massive wrench into Howard's carefully orchestrated plan. He could not control someone who refused to step onto the battlefield he had chosen. I sat back in my chair, stretching my stiff muscles. I had completed my digital preparations. My corporate assets were locked down tight, entirely shielded from any further interference. The evidence of Derek's wire fraud was perfectly compiled, annotated, and ready to be deployed. I had spent 3 days in silence enduring the most vicious social attack of my life, and I had not broken. I looked at the dark screen of my smartphone, knowing that the lack of response was driving Howard and Derek insane. They were waiting for me to surrender. They had no idea that I was not retreating. I was simply holding my breath, waiting for them to make their final fatal move. I knew Howard could not stand the silence much longer. He was a man who demanded immediate submission, and my quiet defiance was a direct insult to his authority. The trap was fully set, and all I needed now was the trigger. The morning of the fourth day broke with a heavy, oppressive humidity that seeped through the window panes of my mother's guest bedroom. For 72 hours, I had existed in a state of absolute digital quarantine. I had not answered a single phone call. I had not replied to a single text message. I had let Susan scream her fabricated victimhood into the echo chamber of suburban social media without offering a single word of defense. The silence in the house was thick and expectant. My mother, Joanne, was pacing the kitchen floor, her anxiety manifesting in the relentless scrubbing of already clean countertops. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop. She knew as well as I did that Howard was not a man who could tolerate being ignored. His ego required constant feeding, and my absolute refusal to engage was starving him. He needed a reaction. He needed to see me break. And since his social manipulation had failed to draw me out into the open, I knew his next maneuver would be a direct frontal assault. At precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, the silence was finally shattered. A sharp ping echoed from my laptop speakers, cutting through the quiet hum of the air conditioning. It was not a text message notification or a Facebook tag. It was the distinct chime of my secure corporate email client receiving a high-priority communication. I set down my coffee mug and slid into the chair, staring at the glowing screen. I did not feel a spike of fear. I felt the steady hum of pure adrenaline. The trigger I had been waiting for had finally arrived. The email was not sent from Derek's personal account. It did not come with a familiar subject line or any semblance of marital communication. The sender was listed as a senior managing partner at one of the most ruthless and expensive corporate litigation firms in downtown Chicago. These were Howard's personal attack dogs. They were men who wore $5,000 suits and specialized in burying small businesses in endless mountains of legal paperwork until they submitted to Howard's demands. The subject line read simply and coldly, "Notice of intent to file emergency custody injunction and summons for mediation." I clicked open the document and began to read. I did not read it as a terrified wife or a heartbroken mother. I read it with the clinical detachment of a senior logistics consultant analyzing a competitor's hostile takeover bid. The letter was a masterpiece of aggressive corporate bullying masquerading as family law. It was incredibly long, filled with dense, intimidating legal jargon designed specifically to overwhelm and paralyze a civilian reader. Howard had clearly spared no expense having his legal team draft a document that was intended to drop me to my knees in absolute terror. The first page of the email did not mention my car or the confrontation at the country club. It went straight for the jugular. Derek, officially acting through his father's legal counsel, was threatening to file an ex parte emergency motion for full physical and legal custody of our 1-year-old son Leo. The justification they laid out was breathtaking in its sheer calculated cruelty. The lawyers stated that I had suffered a severe documented psychological breakdown, rendering me a clear and present danger to the child's immediate physical safety. They referenced Susan's fabricated social media posts as community evidence of my erratic and unpredictable behavior. But the true sickness of their strategy was revealed in the financial section of the legal threat. Derek was officially claiming that I had absolutely zero financial means to provide food, shelter, or basic medical care for our infant son. The legal document explicitly cited my completely drained checking and savings accounts as absolute undeniable proof of my destitution. They wrote that I was an unfit, destitute mother who was currently relying on the charity of relatives to survive because I possessed no independent wealth or income whatsoever. The audacity of the claim was so massive it bordered on comedic. My husband had illegally hacked into my secure corporate holding account, siphoned every single penny of my hard-earned consulting bonuses, wired it directly into his father's failing commercial distribution business, and was now turning around to use my newly engineered poverty as legal grounds to legally strip my child away from me. He had stolen my armor and was now pointing to my bare chest, claiming I was unfit for battle. Derek thought he had executed a flawless checkmate. He believed that by holding my son hostage with a manufactured financial crisis, I would immediately surrender every single ounce of my dignity. He thought the sheer terror of losing Leo to the state foster system, or to Howard's sprawling estate, would blind me to the colossal legal errors he had committed to get us to this point. I scrolled down to the final page of the PDF attachment. The aggressive posturing and threats of immediate court intervention suddenly shifted into a thinly veiled offer of a backroom deal. The email concluded with a strict mandatory summons for a family mediation meeting. It stated that out of the goodness of his heart and his desire to preserve the legacy of the family, Derek was willing to hold off on filing the emergency custody injunction if I agreed to meet and settle this matter quietly and privately. The location for this supposed mediation was not a neutral mediator's office. It was scheduled to take place in the main conference room of Howard's high-powered law firm in downtown Chicago the following morning at 10 o'clock sharp. It was the ultimate power play. They wanted me to drive into the city walk, into their glittering glass tower, and sit across a massive mahogany table completely outnumbered by men in expensive suits. They wanted to pull me into their territorial stronghold where they held every single perceived advantage. They were setting the stage for an absolute massacre. I leaned back in my chair, my eyes scanning the harsh block text of the official summons. The meeting was a trap designed to force my signature on whatever horrific concessions they had drawn up. They needed me terrified, desperate, and willing to sign away my entire life just to keep my baby in my arms. Howard wanted to watch me break in a boardroom where he felt like a king. He wanted to look down at me from across a polished table and relish in the total destruction of my independence. My mother walked into the guest room, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She saw the intense focus on my face and stepped up behind my chair, reading the screen over my shoulder. As her eyes scanned the bold legal threats regarding Leo's custody, she let out a sharp gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth and she began to shake. She asked me what we were going to do. She asked if they could really just take a baby away from his mother based on an empty bank account and some vicious Facebook rumors. She was spiraling into exactly the kind of panicked response that Howard had engineered this entire document to elicit. I turned to look at my mother. I reached out and gently placed my hand over hers, stopping her trembling. I told her that they were not going to take Leo anywhere. I explained that Howard and Derek were arrogant men who operated on fear and intimidation, but they lacked the fundamental intelligence to cover their own tracks. They had just put their entire malicious strategy in writing and sent it through a traceable corporate email server. They had officially documented their intent to use stolen funds as leverage in a family court proceeding. They had just handed me a signed confession wrapped in expensive legal letterhead. I looked back at the glowing screen, reading the strict summons for the family mediation meeting one more time. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. They wanted a quiet settlement. They wanted me isolated, submissive, and completely broken. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold, clinical precision of my corporate training take complete control of my mind. I was no longer a betrayed wife or a targeted mother. I was a professional consultant preparing to execute a hostile takeover. I was going to walk into that glittering glass tower tomorrow morning. I was going to sit across that massive mahogany table, but I was not going to be the one begging for mercy. The legal threat was not the end of my life. It was the formal invitation to their absolute destruction. I began to organize my files into a sleek black leather portfolio, ensuring every single piece of evidence was impeccably arranged for maximum devastation. The smear campaign and the brutal legal threats had tested my patience, but they had also provided me with the ultimate ammunition. Let them prepare their smug speeches and their predatory contracts. They had no idea what was truly coming for them. I stared out the window, watching the breeze rustle the leaves on the old oak tree. The storm was finally coming. Howard and Derek had spent days building their fragile house of cards. Tomorrow I blow it down. I read the final paragraphs of the legal summons again, my eyes scanning the harsh block text that detailed the precise terms of my surrender. Howard and Derek were not just asking for an apology anymore. They were demanding total, absolute subjugation. The email outlined a draconian post-nuptial agreement that read more like a prison sentence than a marital contract. According to their expensive lawyers, I was required to sign away any and all financial rights to the marital home. I was to immediately hand over the clear title to my newly paid-off SUV, transferring ownership directly to Howard. And worst of all, the document explicitly stated that I must immediately resign from my remote consulting job. They demanded that I become a fully compliant, closely monitored stay-at-home mother who relied entirely on a meager weekly allowance distributed at Derek's sole discretion. The lawyers made the ultimatum crystal clear. If I signed this horrific post-nuptial agreement and accepted my role as an obedient subordinate, they would graciously return my stolen $65,000 and drop the emergency custody injunction. If I refused, they promised to drag me through a brutal, high-profile family court battle where they would use my empty bank accounts and my supposed mental instability to strip Leo away from me forever. They genuinely believed they had me trapped in a corner with absolutely no way out. They thought the sheer terror of losing my son would force me to sign away my entire life without a second thought. I stared at the glowing screen, the audacity of their demands washing over me. They wanted to break me. They wanted to look down at me from across a mahogany conference table and watch me surrender my independence, my career, and my dignity just to keep my baby. They had built this massive, intimidating legal trap, expecting me to cower in fear. I moved my cursor to the reply button. I did not type out a frantic defense. I did not beg for mercy or try to explain my side of the story to their aggressive lawyers. I hit reply and typed a single calm, devastating word. Agreed. I hit send, watching the confirmation notification pop up on the screen. The email shot off into the digital void, delivering my fake surrender directly to Howard's legal team. I could almost picture the arrogant high fives and the smug smiles happening in their downtown Chicago office when they received my one-word reply. They thought they had won. They thought the battle was over before it even truly began. But the battle was not over. It was just shifting to a battlefield where they had absolutely no idea how to fight. I closed my email client and turned to my mother, Joanne, who was still standing behind my chair, her hands gripping the backrest. She had read the draconian terms over my shoulder and was pale with anxiety. I looked up at her and told her not to worry. I said I was going to need a very large pot of black coffee because I was not going to sleep tonight. For the next 12 hours, the kitchen table in my mother's modest ranch house became my corporate command center. I pulled out a thick black leather portfolio, the kind reserved for high-stakes boardroom presentations, and laid it open on the wooden table. It was finally time to utilize the massive secret I had been quietly harboring for my entire marriage. Howard and Derek always viewed me as a simple work-from-home mother doing basic data entry. They thought my career was a cute little hobby that barely covered my half of the grocery bill. They never bothered to understand what I actually did for a living because their towering arrogance blinded them to the reality of my success. I was not a basic remote worker. I was an elite, highly specialized senior logistics consultant. I orchestrated massive, complex supply chain overhauls for some of the largest international commercial distribution conglomerates in the world. I optimized shipping routes, restructured warehouse protocols, and negotiated multi-million-dollar freight contracts. I was ruthless, I was brilliant, and I was incredibly well compensated for my expertise. Because my income was so substantial and my consulting contracts were so legally complex, I did not operate as a standard independent contractor. I operated all of my business under the protective umbrella of a heavily shielded limited liability company. My LLC was an ironclad corporate entity designed to manage my massive quarterly performance bonuses and protect my assets from personal liability. This was the fatal flaw in Howard's master plan. When Derek logged into what he thought was just a high-yield joint savings account, he had unknowingly breached the designated tax holding account for my registered corporate LLC. The $65,000 he stole was not marital property. It was protected corporate capital. I spent the entire night meticulously compiling the documents that would prove this beyond a shadow of a doubt. I printed out the official articles of incorporation for my LLC, highlighting the specific federal tax identification number associated with the entity. I printed the banking documents that clearly linked that specific high-yield savings account to my corporate ID, not my personal Social Security number. I printed the comprehensive transaction log proving that the $65,000 consisted entirely of direct deposits from major international shipping firms paying my consulting invoices. I arranged these documents perfectly inside the black portfolio. I was building a paper trail that established unequivocally that Derek had committed federal corporate embezzlement. By moving those shielded funds across state lines to Howard's failing distribution business, Derek had also committed wire fraud. The federal penalties for these crimes were severe, carrying mandatory minimum prison sentences and massive financial fines. But the embezzlement was only the first half of my counterstrike. The $65,000 was the bait that Derek had foolishly swallowed, but it was not the actual trap. The true trap was built on a much deeper, much more devastating secret regarding Howard's beloved distribution company. I took another sip of black coffee and pulled up a different set of secure files on my laptop. For years, Howard had mocked me loudly, proclaiming that his business acumen was vastly superior to mine. He constantly belittled my career while bragging about his regional distribution empire. He acted like a titan of industry, a self-made millionaire who was immune to failure. But the numbers did not lie, and I was a master of numbers. While organizing my corporate files a few months ago, I had noticed several glaring inconsistencies in Howard's business model. His supply chain was a disaster. His freight contracts were bloated and inefficient. He was bleeding money at an alarming rate, but covering it up with flashy country club memberships and aggressive posturing. I had quietly run a deep dive financial analysis on his company, utilizing the sophisticated software tools I used for my own elite clients. The results were catastrophic. Howard's distribution business was not booming. It was failing spectacularly. He had been operating in the red for over 2 years, desperately shuffling funds between accounts to create the illusion of solvency. 8 months ago, the situation had become so dire that Howard took a massive, desperate gamble. He secretly put the deed to the family home, the sprawling suburban mansion he was so incredibly proud of, up as collateral for a high-risk commercial loan. He needed a massive influx of cash to keep his distribution company afloat, and he bet everything he owned that he could turn the business around. He lost the bet. Howard had defaulted on that commercial loan 90 days ago. The bank was actively preparing for a full foreclosure on his primary residence. But Howard, in a last-ditch effort to save his pride, had managed to stall the bank by promising a sudden influx of capital. He was waiting for a miracle that was never going to come. I printed the documents confirming Howard's loan default and the impending foreclosure on his mansion. I added them to the black portfolio. But I was not finished. I had one final document to print, the document that would completely obliterate Howard's entire existence. When I discovered Howard's defaulted commercial loan last month, I recognized a unique opportunity. The bank holding the toxic debt was desperate to offload it from their books. They were willing to sell the debt to a private equity firm at a significant discount just to cut their losses. I did not just sit back and watch Howard fail. I took action. I utilized the massive accumulated corporate consulting bonuses sitting safely in my other shielded business accounts. I formed a secondary anonymous private equity LLC specifically for this transaction. Through this anonymous entity, I approached the bank and quietly purchased Howard's defaulted debt. I printed the final document and slid it into the back pocket of the leather portfolio. It was the official legal transfer of the deed and the primary lien on Howard's family mansion. I was the sole proprietor of that anonymous private equity firm. I had bought Howard's debt out from under him. He did not own the roof over his head anymore. I did. Furthermore, because Howard had foolishly tied his primary business assets to that defaulted commercial loan, I now held the primary lien on his entire distribution company. I essentially owned everything he had ever built. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale light into my mother's kitchen. I closed the black leather portfolio, the satisfying snap of the clasp echoing in the quiet room. I was ready. The trap was fully armed. I stood up, stretched my tired muscles, and walked to the guest room to shower and change into my sharpest corporate suit. I was going to walk into that downtown Chicago law firm, looking like a senior executive, not a defeated wife. I was going to sit across that mahogany table and watch Howard and Derek realize that they had picked a fight with a woman who operated on an entirely different level of power. The elevator ride to the 44th floor of the downtown Chicago high-rise was smooth and silent. I checked my reflection in the polished brass doors. I was wearing a tailored charcoal suit, my hair pulled back into a severe knot. I did not look like the exhausted suburban mother they had locked out of her house 4 days ago. I looked like a woman walking into a boardroom to execute a corporate slaughter. I stepped out of the elevator and was immediately greeted by a receptionist who led me down a long, glass-walled corridor. The opulence of the law firm was designed to intimidate. Everything was sleek, modern, and screamed money. But I was not intimidated. I was holding a folder that could buy and sell everyone in this building. I was escorted into a massive conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. Howard, Susan, Derek, and their high-priced corporate lawyer were already seated on one side of a sprawling mahogany table. They looked like a firing squad, waiting for the blindfold to be tied. Howard was leaning back in his leather chair, radiating a smug, suffocating arrogance. Susan sat beside him, wearing a sympathetic pout that was entirely performative. Derek looked nervous, his eyes darting between me and his father. The lawyer, a man named Harrison, who wore an expensive watch and a patronizing smile, sat at the head of the table. I walked in alone. I did not bring Joanne. I did not bring my own legal counsel. Their immediate assumption was that I was terrified, broken, and completely isolated. Harrison gestured to the empty chair across from them. He did not offer me water or coffee. He wanted to maintain the psychological high ground. I set my black leather portfolio on the polished wood and took a seat, keeping my posture perfectly rigid. Howard could not wait to speak. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and let out a short, condescending chuckle. He told me he was glad I finally decided to stop throwing a hysterical tantrum and act like a rational adult. He said he hoped the last few days living off my mother's charity had taught me a valuable lesson about the reality of my financial situation. He told me that family loyalty was paramount, and that today I was going to learn my place once and for all. Susan chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She said she was so relieved I was finally getting the mental help I clearly needed. She claimed she had been praying for me every single day. She told me that Derek still loved me despite my erratic and dangerous behavior, and that they were willing to let me come home if I just followed the rules. Derek stared down at the table, unable to meet my eyes, choosing to let his parents deliver the brutal ultimatums. Harrison, the lawyer, cleared his throat, taking control of the meeting. He slid a thick stack of legal documents across the mahogany table toward me. He placed a silver Mont Blanc pen directly on top of the signature line. He adopted a tone usually reserved for speaking to a slow child. He told me that this was a post-nuptial agreement designed to protect the family assets from any further manic episodes on my part. He outlined the draconian terms exactly as the email had stated. I was to immediately surrender all financial and legal rights to the marital home. I was required to sign over the clear title of my SUV to Howard, and I was legally bound to resign from my remote consulting position, effective immediately. Harrison explained that I would be given a strict weekly allowance managed by Derek to purchase household necessities. He said that if I signed the document right now, they would graciously return the $65,000 they had secured, and they would drop the emergency custody injunction regarding Leo. He told me it was an incredibly generous offer and that I had absolutely no leverage to negotiate. I looked at the thick stack of papers. I looked at the silver pen. I did not reach for either of them. Instead, I looked up and met Howard's gaze. The smug arrogance was still plastered across his face. He thought he had me completely cornered. I reached out and slowly, deliberately pushed the post-nuptial agreement back across the table toward Harrison. The thick packet of paper slid over the polished wood and stopped right in front of the lawyer. Howard's smile faltered slightly. He demanded to know what I was doing. He told me to pick up the pen and sign the damn papers before he called his friends at family court and had Leo permanently removed from my custody. I ignored Howard entirely. I unclasped my black leather portfolio. The sharp snap echoed in the quiet conference room. I pulled out a single sheet of paper and slid it directly across the table to Harrison. I told the lawyer that before we discussed any ridiculous post-nuptial agreements, we needed to address a massive federal crime that his clients had committed exactly 4 days ago. Harrison frowned, looking down at the document. It was a certified bank record detailing the $65,000 wire transfer. He scoffed and told me that moving marital funds between joint accounts was not a crime. He said Derek had every legal right to secure those assets to prevent me from draining them during a manic episode. I smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that made Derek physically flinch. I informed Harrison that he needed to look much closer at the account numbers listed on that transfer. I explained that Derek did not drain a standard joint marital checking account. I told the table loud and clear that Derek had logged into the designated tax holding account for my registered corporate limited liability company. The room went dead silent. Harrison's eyes darted back down to the paper. The color began to slowly drain from his face as he realized what he was looking at. He saw the federal tax identification number clearly printed at the top of the banking document. He saw the corporate entity name. I kept my voice perfectly level, delivering the execution with absolute precision. I explained that I operate all my international logistics consulting under a heavily shielded LLC structure. The $65,000 inside that specific account was protected corporate capital. It consisted entirely of direct deposits from major international shipping conglomerates paying my consulting invoices. It was money specifically set aside to cover my federal and state corporate tax liabilities. I turned my gaze to Derek, who was now sweating profusely. I told my husband that by logging into that specific account deliberately, moving shielded corporate funds and wiring them directly into his father's commercial distribution business, without my explicit authorization, he did not just commit a simple marital betrayal. I told him he had just committed federal corporate embezzlement. I then turned to Howard. I told him that by accepting those stolen corporate funds into his own business account across state lines, he was now an active accessory to wire fraud. I explained that the federal penalties for these crimes carry mandatory minimum prison sentences and catastrophic financial fines. Susan gasped, clutching Howard's arm. Howard tried to bluster his way out of the trap. He pounded his fist on the table, shouting that I was lying. He claimed it was just a regular savings account and that I was trying to confuse his lawyer with fake documents. He told Harrison to ignore my hysterical threats. But Harrison was not ignoring me. The lawyer was staring at the paper, his hands visibly shaking. He was a corporate litigator, and he knew exactly what he was looking at. He knew that I had just handed him a digital confession to a federal crime. I did not stop. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. I announced to the room that the bank's fraud department had already been notified. I informed them that the IRS had received a formal report regarding the unauthorized transfer of corporate tax funds. I told them that the digital footprint Derek left was absolutely airtight. I had the IP addresses, the routing numbers, and the exact timestamps. Harrison's silver Mont Blanc pen slipped from his fingers and clattered loudly onto the mahogany table. He looked at Howard, his professional demeanor completely shattered. He told his client in a strained, panicked whisper that they were in severe, unrecoverable legal jeopardy. He explained that if I pressed charges, Derek would absolutely go to federal prison and Howard's business accounts would be immediately frozen, pending a massive federal investigation. The power dynamic in the room violently flipped. The arrogant men who had tried to force me into submission were now staring at a woman who held their entire future in the palm of her hand. Howard was practically hyperventilating, his face shifting from purple rage to chalky white terror. Derek looked like he was about to vomit. He realized he had just ruined his own life trying to protect his father's fragile ego. Susan began to cry. Not the fake performative tears she used on Facebook, but genuine hysterical sobs of absolute panic. She realized that her comfortable suburban life was about to be obliterated by a federal indictment. I sat back in my chair watching their entire world collapse. I told them that their post-nuptial agreement was worthless. I told them their emergency custody threats were pathetic. They had built a trap thinking I was a helpless victim, but they had actually handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them, and I was not even finished yet. The embezzlement was just the opening act. I still had the second half of my portfolio to deploy. Howard did not capitulate gracefully. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life bullying people into submission, and he simply could not process the fact that a woman he considered completely insignificant had just outmaneuvered him on a federal level. He shot out of his leather chair, slamming his palms flat onto the mahogany table. The sudden violent movement made Susan flinch and Derek actively recoil. He leaned forward, his face mere inches from mine, his breath heavy with the sour smell of stale coffee and desperation. He sneered, trying to resurrect the imposing tyrannical patriarch persona he had wielded so effectively just 4 days ago on my front porch. He laughed, a harsh, forced sound that echoed hollowly in the massive conference room. He told me I was nothing but a dramatic, hysterical little girl playing dress-up in a corporate boardroom. He loudly announced to his panicked lawyer that this entire display was pathetic. Howard puffed out his chest and declared that he could wire $65,000 back into my stupid little LLC account before lunch. He bragged that his regional distribution business was currently having its most profitable quarter in a decade, and that 65 grand was literally pocket change to him. He sneered that I was making a massive deal out of a minor clerical error that Derek made while trying to protect the family. Then he leaned even closer, dropping his voice to a menacing, condescending whisper. He reminded me with absolute arrogant certainty that even if I got my precious little bonus money back, I was still a guest in his kingdom. He stated emphatically that he still owned the literal roof over my head. He told me that my name might be on the mortgage, but his massive down payment was the only reason I was not raising his grandson in a cheap apartment. He commanded me to drop the federal threats, pack up my little black folder, and drive straight back to the house where I belonged before he officially initiated eviction proceedings and threw me out onto the street permanently. I did not flinch. I did not move away from him. I sat perfectly still, absorbing his pathetic attempt at intimidation and feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, calculating satisfaction. I looked up into his angry, bloodshot eyes and smiled. It was the same smile I had given him at the country club, right before I forced him to surrender my car keys. I told Howard that it was truly fascinating to hear him brag about his booming distribution business. I said it was incredible that he had so much liquid capital available right now. Because according to the comprehensive financial analysis I ran on his company last month, he was actually bleeding money at a catastrophic, unsustainable rate. Howard froze. His mouth snapped shut, cutting off his next insult before it could even form. His eyes darted nervously to his lawyer Harrison, who was currently wiping sweat from his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. I reached back into my black leather portfolio. The soft sound of sliding paper was the only noise in the room. I pulled out a second stack of documents much thicker than the first, and placed it precisely in the center of the mahogany table directly between Howard and his lawyer. I did not just slide it over. I pushed it with purpose, ensuring it landed right under the harsh glare of the overhead lighting. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting the absolute certainty of my words dismantle his reality, piece by piece. I told the room that Howard's supply chain protocols were a complete archaic disaster. I explained that his freight contracts were bloated, inefficient, and actively destroying his profit margins. I stated loudly and clearly so Derek and Susan could hear every single syllable that Howard's company had been operating severely in the red for over 2 full years. I turned my gaze to Susan, who was currently clutching her pearl necklace, her face a mask of profound confusion. I told my mother-in-law that her husband had been desperately shuffling funds between various corporate and personal accounts for 24 months, just to create the fragile illusion of solvency, so she could keep taking her expensive European vacations and hosting lavish country club dinners. I told her that the empire she was so incredibly proud of was nothing but an empty, decaying shell. Howard slammed his hand on the table again, shouting that I was a liar. He pointed his finger at Harrison, demanding that the lawyer throw me out of the building for corporate espionage and slander. He claimed my documents were complete fabrications generated by a bitter, vengeful woman. Harrison did not move to throw me out. The lawyer tentatively reached out and pulled the thick stack of documents toward him. He flipped open the cover page and began to read. I watched his eyes scan the text, tracking his growing horror as he processed the highly classified financial data I had legally acquired through public commercial registries and aggressive corporate auditing techniques. I turned back to Howard, looking at him with absolute clinical detachment. I told him he should save his breath, because we both knew I was telling the entire unvarnished truth. Then I delivered the first part of the ultimate fatal blow. I explained that 8 months ago, Howard realized his company was weeks away from total insolvency. He needed a massive immediate influx of cash just to make payroll and keep the lights on in his distribution warehouses. But because his credit score was garbage, a fact I had already established at the country club, and his business was failing, no reputable bank would touch him. So Howard took a massive, desperate, and incredibly high-risk gamble. I pointed directly at Derek, who was currently sinking lower and lower into his expensive leather chair, trying to become completely invisible. I told my husband that his father was a coward who gambled with his son's entire life without ever asking for permission. I announced to the room that 8 months ago, Howard secretly put the deed to the family home, the sprawling suburban brick house that Derek and I lived in, up as collateral for a predatory high-interest commercial loan. He leveraged the roof over our heads, the home where my son slept, to secure a desperate cash injection for his failing business. Susan let out a sharp, audible gasp. She turned to Howard, her eyes wide with betrayal, demanding to know if what I was saying was true. Howard refused to look at his wife. He stared dead ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. I continued my public execution of his legacy. I told Susan that her husband had bet everything our family owned that he could turn his archaic business around. And I told her with absolute finality that Howard had lost that bet spectacularly. I looked at Harrison, the lawyer, who had stopped reading and was now staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated fear. I told Harrison to flip to the third page of the packet. I instructed him to read the commercial loan status report aloud to his client. Harrison swallowed hard. He looked at Howard, then back down at the paper. In a strained, shaking voice, the expensive corporate lawyer confirmed my assessment. He stated that according to the documents, the commercial loan secured by the property deed was officially in severe default. He confirmed that Howard had not made a single payment in 90 days. I leaned back in my chair, clasping my hands together and resting them in my lap. I looked at Howard and delivered the devastating reality of his current situation. I told him that the bank was not just threatening foreclosure, they had already initiated the process. I explained that the bank viewed his debt as completely toxic and they were actively preparing to seize the property to recover their losses. I told Howard that he did not own the roof over my head anymore. I said the bank owned it and they were coming for it. The smug tyrant who had locked a mother and infant outside in 90-degree heat just 4 days ago was now staring down the barrel of total absolute homelessness. He had tried to use financial power to crush me into submission, but his own financial incompetence had just blown up directly in his face. The trap had not just sprung, it had completely decimated his entire existence. But I was not finished. The foreclosure was just the setup. The final knockout punch was still sitting safely inside my black leather portfolio, ready to end this war once and for all. I watched the blood drain entirely from Howard's face as Harrison finished reading the default status of the commercial loan. The arrogant tyrant who had spent 5 years treating me like a disposable subordinate was now struggling just to draw breath. He looked frantically at his lawyer, silently begging for some sort of legal loophole, some magical escape hatch that would save his sprawling suburban mansion from the bank's aggressive foreclosure team. Harrison had nothing to offer him. The lawyer sat back in his expensive leather chair, looking physically ill. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the massive mahogany table. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents above us. I told Howard that he was incredibly lucky. I explained that banks typically do not like holding on to toxic defaulted assets for very long. They prefer to cut their losses quickly and aggressively. I said that just last month the bank was preparing to execute the final foreclosure protocols, which would have resulted in his immediate public eviction from the property he prized so highly. Susan gasped, clutching her pearl necklace tighter. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and utter confusion. She demanded to know what I meant by lucky. She asked how any of this catastrophic financial news could possibly be considered good luck for their family. I smiled. It was a cold, detached smile that sent a visible shiver down Derek's spine. I turned my attention fully to Susan. I told my mother-in-law that Howard was lucky because a private equity firm swooped in at the very last second. I explained that this private equity firm specialized in acquiring distressed commercial assets. They approached the bank directly and offered to purchase Howard's entire defaulted debt portfolio at a significant discount. The bank, desperate to clear the toxic loan off their ledgers, agreed to the sale almost immediately. I told the room that this private equity firm had quietly and legally assumed total ownership of the debt. They had bought the loan out from under Howard entirely. The bank was no longer the primary creditor. The private equity firm was now the entity holding the literal keys to Howard's entire existence. Howard let out a shaky, ragged breath. He tried to puff out his chest, grasping desperately at the last remaining shreds of his authority. He told me that this was none of my business. He said that he would simply negotiate a new payment plan with this private equity firm. He arrogantly proclaimed that these firms were always willing to make a deal if the price was right, and he was more than capable of handling sophisticated corporate negotiations without the input of his hysterical daughter-in-law. I slowly reached into the back pocket of my black leather portfolio. The soft sound of sliding paper echoed loudly in the tense silence of the conference room. I pulled out a single thick document bound by a heavy legal seal. It was the most important piece of paper I had ever held in my hands. I placed it perfectly in the center of the table, right next to the evidence of Derek's federal wire fraud. I looked Howard dead in the eye and delivered the absolute ultimate reveal. I told him he was not going to be negotiating with a faceless corporate entity. I said he was not going to be making any deals, or setting up any payment plans. I pushed the document slightly forward, ensuring it was directly under the harsh glare of the overhead lighting. I told him to look closely at the signature on the deed transfer and the primary lien assignment. I announced to the room with absolute unwavering certainty that I was the sole proprietor and chief executive officer of that private equity firm. I told them that I had utilized the massive accumulated corporate consulting bonuses sitting safely in my shielded business accounts to execute the purchase. I had bought Howard's toxic debt. I owned the loan. I owned the lien. Howard stared at the document, his eyes tracking the bold black text that listed my name as the primary controlling authority. He looked like a man who had just been struck by lightning. His mouth opened and closed, but he could not force a single word past the sheer horror paralyzing his throat. I did not stop there. I kept my voice perfectly level, driving the final nails into his coffin with surgical precision. I told Howard that he did not own the roof over my head. I said he did not own the roof over his own head. I pointed directly at the legal seal on the document and stated unequivocally that I owned the house. I owned the sprawling suburban mansion he used to intimidate his country club peers. I owned the property he had tried to use as leverage to force me into submission. Susan let out a strangled sob, burying her face in her hands. The reality of her impending social and financial annihilation had finally shattered her performative facade. She realized that her entire identity, built on wealth and status, had just been completely obliterated by the woman she had spent 5 days smearing on Facebook. I turned my gaze back to Howard, who was currently clutching the edge of the mahogany table, trying to keep himself from collapsing out of his chair. I told him that the absolute worst part of his situation was not losing the house. I explained that because he was so incredibly desperate for that initial commercial loan, he had foolishly tied all of his primary business assets to the property deed as cross-collateral. I leaned closer, dropping my voice to a terrifyingly calm whisper. I told Howard that because he defaulted on the loan, and because I now held the primary lien, I did not just own his house. I announced that I now held the controlling lien on his entire regional distribution company. I owned his warehouses. I owned his transport fleet. I owned his inventory. I owned everything he had ever built. I owned his entire legacy. The power dynamic in the room did not just shift. It violently, completely imploded. The arrogant patriarchal tyrant who had spent 5 years treating me like a disposable subordinate was now sitting across from me, realizing that I possessed the absolute legal authority to liquidate his entire existence with a single phone call. Derek, who had been practically silent since I walked into the room, suddenly surged forward. He reached across the table, his hands shaking violently, pleading with me to stop. He begged me to tell him this was all just a massive misunderstanding. He claimed that we were a family, and that families do not destroy each other over money. He tried to grab my hand, but I pulled it back sharply, refusing to let him touch me. I looked at my husband, feeling absolutely nothing but profound disgust. I told Derek that he lost the right to use the word family the exact moment he locked his infant son out of his home in a dangerous heat wave. I reminded him that just 4 days ago he had smugly informed me that I had absolutely nothing without them. I told him that he was wrong. I said I had everything, and they were the ones who were about to have absolutely nothing. Harrison, the expensive corporate lawyer, slowly reached out and pulled the deed transfer document toward him. He read through the dense legal text, his face growing paler by the second. He looked up at Howard, his professional demeanor entirely gone, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. He leaned in and whispered frantically to his client, confirming that every single word I had just said was legally accurate and completely undeniable. The lawyer told Howard in a strained, hushed voice that they were in severe, unrecoverable legal and financial jeopardy. He explained that I had established a perfect airtight trap. If they tried to fight the lien, I would immediately press federal charges for the corporate embezzlement Derek had committed. If they tried to negotiate, I held absolute total leverage over every single asset they possessed. Harrison looked at me, then back to Howard, and delivered his final brutal assessment. He told his client that the war was over and they had lost everything. Howard slumped back in his chair, his eyes glazed and unseeing. The realization that his empire was gone, that his son was facing federal prison, and that his wife was sobbing uncontrollably next to him finally broke him completely. He did not yell. He did not threaten me. He simply stared blankly at the mahogany table, a defeated, broken man. I sat back in my chair, feeling the cool, smooth leather against my back. I looked at the three people who had tried to systematically destroy my life to protect their fragile egos. I did not feel triumphant or joyous. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of finality. The toxic cycle of control, manipulation, and abuse was permanently severed. I had walked into their territorial stronghold completely outnumbered, and I had executed a flawless, total victory. They had built a cage for me, but they had actually locked themselves inside and handed me the only key. The ambush was over, the empire was mine, and the next phase of my life was about to begin on my own absolute terms. Harrison pushed his chair back from the mahogany table as if the polished wood had suddenly caught fire. The expensive corporate lawyer did not bother trying to formulate a defense because there was absolutely no defense left to construct. He leaned closer to Howard, and his voice, stripped of all its previous condescension, shook with genuine professional panic. He explicitly told his client that the situation was not just bad, it was completely unrecoverable. Harrison explained that I had executed a flawless financial checkmate. He pointed to the documents confirming my ownership of the private equity firm, and told Howard that if he attempted to challenge the lien, I would immediately trigger the federal investigation into the $65,000 Derek had embezzled. The lawyer made it brutally clear that Howard was facing a choice between complete financial liquidation or watching his only son go to federal prison for wire fraud. Howard sat frozen in his leather chair. The vibrant, aggressive color that usually painted his face when he was angry had entirely drained away, leaving behind a sickly pale gray. His jaw hung slightly open, but the booming, authoritative voice he used to command rooms and terrorize his family was completely gone. He stared blindly at the documents, recognizing the absolute finality of his defeat. He had spent his entire life building an empire on intimidation, smoke, and mirrors. He had thought he was a titan of industry, but he was really just an arrogant bully who had over-leveraged his life to maintain an illusion. Now that illusion was shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He realized with crushing clarity that he had lost his company, his leverage, his sprawling suburban mansion, and his entire legacy in a single morning. Susan broke the suffocating silence. She let out a high-pitched wail that echoed painfully off the glass walls of the conference room. The reality of their impending bankruptcy hit her with the force of a physical blow. She looked at her husband, waiting for him to bellow an order to fix it, waiting for him to magically restore their country club status and their luxurious vacations. When Howard did not even blink, Susan buried her face in her hands and burst into hysterical, racking sobs. She realized that there would be no more catered dinners, no more designer shopping sprees, and no more looking down on her neighbors. She was going to lose the only thing that gave her life meaning, which was her artificial social superiority. Her tears were not for her family or her marriage, they were purely for the loss of her own comfortable, affluent bubble. As his parents descended into financial and emotional ruin, Derek finally seemed to grasp the catastrophic magnitude of his own actions. The smug, triumphant smirk he had worn when he locked me out of our house was replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. He looked at the federal wire fraud evidence sitting on the table and realized his father was not going to save him. Howard could not even save himself. Derek lunged forward, practically throwing himself across the conference table toward me. His voice cracked, pitching upward into a desperate, pathetic whine. He begged me to listen to him. He pleaded for forgiveness, claiming that he never actually wanted to transfer the corporate funds. He aggressively pointed a shaking finger at his silent, defeated father and blamed him for everything. Derek swore that Howard had forced him to do it, threatening to cut him out of the distribution business if he did not comply. He told me he was just trying to protect our family legacy. He reached his hand out across the polished wood, begging me to call off the lawyers to come back home and to just let everything go back to normal so we could be a happy family again. I looked at the man I had married. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy. I felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical disgust. I pulled my hand back, ensuring he could not touch me. I told him in a voice as hard and unyielding as steel that our marriage was over the exact second he chose to lock his crying infant son outside in a dangerous heat wave. I reminded him that just 4 days ago he stood on our front porch and laughed at my pain, confident that I had absolutely nothing without his family. I reached into the final pocket of my black leather portfolio. I pulled out a thick, legally bound manila envelope and dropped it squarely onto the table in front of him. I told Derek those were his divorce papers. I explained that they were accompanied by an emergency filing for sole physical and legal custody of our son Leo. Derek stared at the envelope, trembling. He tried to argue, claiming no judge would ever grant me full custody and completely strip a father of his rights. He threatened to fight me in family court until I was bankrupt. I leaned in and completely extinguished his final spark of false bravado. I told Derek that he was not going to fight me on a single term in those documents. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the bank record, proving his illegal wire transfer. I told him that this piece of paper was my absolute leverage. I explained that if he tried to contest the divorce, if he asked for a single penny in alimony, if he demanded any custody or visitation rights whatsoever, I would immediately hand this federal evidence directly to the authorities. I told him he would sign the divorce papers exactly as they were drafted, relinquishing all parental rights and walking away with absolutely nothing, or he would spend the next 10 years in a federal penitentiary explaining to his cellmates how he stole money from his wife's corporate tax account. Derek looked at Harrison, begging the lawyer to tell him I was bluffing. Harrison just looked away, refusing to make eye contact. The lawyer knew I held all the cards and the deck was entirely stacked in my favor. Derek slowly reached out and picked up his father's silver pen with a shaking hand. He hesitated for one final agonizing second, hoping for a miracle rescue that simply did not exist. The crushing silence in the conference room offered no salvation. He slowly pressed the silver pen to the paper, and I watched him sign his name on every single page, surrendering his entire life because he was too weak to stand up to his father and too foolish to respect his wife. Every stroke of that pen was a binding legal admission of his own catastrophic failure. The man who had mocked me from behind a locked door was now legally bound to a life of total isolation, completely severed from the son he had endangered. I stood up from the mahogany table. I gathered my black leather portfolio, snapped it shut, and walked out of the conference room without a single backward glance. I left them sitting in the wreckage of their own profound arrogance. I did not need to watch them crumble any further. My victory was absolute and my freedom was officially secured. Exactly 1 year later, the intense sweltering heat of that dramatic July afternoon felt like a distant, faded memory. The seasons had changed, and so had the entire trajectory of my existence. Howard's distribution business did not survive the transition. Without the artificial life support of his fraudulent commercial loans, the company hemorrhaged money and was swiftly forced into total liquidation to pay off its massive debts. The sprawling suburban brick mansion, the house he used to threaten and control me, was seized and sold. Howard and Susan were forced to downsize drastically, moving into a tiny, modest apartment on the outskirts of the city. Without his wealth and country club status, Howard became a bitter, silent old man, while Susan lost every single one of her affluent social connections. Their empire was completely dismantled, reduced to dust by their own predatory greed. Derek fared no better. Stripped of his promised inheritance and burdened by the crushing legal fees required to quietly navigate the fallout of his financial crimes, he was forced to take a grueling dead-end job just to keep himself afloat. He lived in a cramped studio apartment, completely isolated from the family legacy he had sacrificed his marriage to protect. I was sitting on the wide wrap-around porch of the beautiful home that I now rightfully and legally owned, free and clear. A gentle spring breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine across the freshly cut lawn. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling a profound, unwavering sense of peace settling comfortably in my chest. The journey to this moment had required an immense amount of personal resilience and unwavering strategic focus. The nights I had spent staring at my glowing laptop screen, preparing my defensive measures, had finally yielded the ultimate return on investment. I had proven that true strength does not require screaming or throwing tantrums. True strength requires recognizing your own worth and possessing the absolute courage to defend it against anyone who tries to tear you down. Out on the bright green grass, my son Leo was laughing joyfully as he chased a brightly colored ball. He was 2 years old now, thriving and blissfully unaware of the toxic legacy I had severed to protect his future. He was growing up in a home filled with unconditional support, free from the suffocating demands of a narcissistic patriarch and a cowardly father. My mother, Joanne, sat in the wicker chair right beside me, peacefully sipping a glass of iced sweet tea. She watched her grandson play, a warm, genuine smile lighting up her face. She reached over and gently patted my arm, silently, acknowledging the incredible journey we had navigated together over the past 12 months. I smiled back, taking a sip of my own tea. I looked at the life I had meticulously built. I had not just survived their horrific abuse and their cowardly financial ambush. I had strategically dismantled their entire corrupt empire and used the scattered pieces to construct my own authentic, deeply fulfilling reality. I was a successful, independent woman, a fiercely protective mother, and the sole architect of my own destiny. They thought they could strip away my power to keep me controlled, but they only succeeded in teaching me exactly how incredibly powerful I truly was. The war was definitively over, and the peace I had fought so ruthlessly to secure was finally beautifully mine. Looking back on that sweltering July afternoon and everything that followed, I realized that the most profound lesson I learned was about the true nature of power. For years, I believed that keeping the peace meant making myself small. I swallowed insults, tolerated disrespect, and allowed my boundaries to be trampled because I thought that was what family required. I thought that if I worked hard enough and accommodated their demands, they would eventually value me. But toxic people do not respect accommodation. They only respect leverage. The moment my husband locked me out of our home and drained my accounts, he thought he was stripping away my power. Instead, he handed me the clarity I desperately needed. I learned that your worth is not defined by how the loudest person in the room treats you. True security does not come from appeasing bullies or begging for a seat at a table where you are secretly despised. True security comes from within, and from the undeniable reality of your own independence. When they tried to trap me, they forced me to rely entirely on my own capabilities. I learned that standing up for yourself does not always require screaming or matching their chaos. Sometimes the most devastating response is absolute cold composure and the quiet execution of a well-laid plan. You have the right to protect your peace, your children, and your future, even if it means walking away from the people you once trusted. Family is supposed to be a sanctuary, not a battlefield. If you are currently trapped in a situation where you are constantly diminished, manipulated, or controlled, please know that you are stronger than they want you to believe. Start building your own safety net today, no matter how small. Have you ever had to draw a hard line to protect your own peace from toxic family members? I would love to hear your stories of survival and triumph in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe to join a community of people who choose self-respect over toxic loyalty. Remember, your future is entirely yours to build.